Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful historical morsels of British political history.
And this week we're talking about one of the thorniest issues in global politics, Israel. In particular, we'll be looking at the remarkable story of how, for much of its existence, Labour was the most pro-Israel party in British politics. But first, we begin our podcast each week with a segment called Matters of Interest, where we discuss something we've learned in the past week that we think is interesting. This week, I'll kick us off, and I want to talk about the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool. Liverpool is very near to where I grew up. I spent a lot of time there when I was younger, and it's a city I love a great deal. If you haven't been, and it's surprising how often you meet people in the UK who haven't been to Liverpool, you really must. Thanks to the redevelopment in recent years, the waterfront in particular is stunning, from the Albert Dock and the Three Graces, alongside some of the new developments that are going on. But if the recent story of Liverpool is about investment and growth, the story of the Adelphi Hotel is the reverse. It's become something of a running joke that the hotel, which is just a few minutes away from Lime Street Station, is a dive. Richard and I stayed there once, and there was a hole in the wall that had been punched in, it seems. The chest of drawers was missing a drawer. The bath handle had been broken off and there was just some rusty gap left there. It was all a bit grim, but it didn't used to be like that. What reminded me of this was a book I dipped into recently, Bill Deed's memoirs. Deeds was a journalist for the Morning Post, later the Telegraph, and a Tory MP. And in 1935, he was staying in Liverpool to report on the Wavertree by-election, in which Randolph Churchill, the son of Winston, was standing against the official Conservative candidate, partly in protest to Stanley Baldwin's policy of working towards self-determination for India. Both Deeds and Churchill stayed at the Adelphi, and here's what Deeds wrote about it. The Adelphi Hotel has become the nearest thing Britain has to the Ritz Hotel in Paris. Designed to cater for wealthy Americans crossing the Atlantic and disembarking at the port of Liverpool, it afforded every comfort. Never subsequently have I eaten better than I did in the Adelphi's French restaurant, where the dinner of 6 courses cost just 8 shillings and sixpence. But Deeds isn't the only one to really admire the Adelphi. Eleanor Roosevelt, no less, said it was one of only 2 hotels in Europe worth staying at, alongside the George V in Paris. That remains, I understand, a very grand and luxurious hotel. And when I looked a little earlier, a room there will set you back about £2,000. That's not quite the case at the Adelphi. And as may be of interest to some of our listeners, Harold Wilson used to use the Adelphi for his constituency surgeries and to stay when on constituency duties in Huyton nearby. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that he was there the night of the 1964 general election, which saw him become Prime Minister. So the Adelphi, which was once so grand and has so much history, appears to have been run into the ground. It's a real tragedy, and if there's an eccentric billionaire out there who wants to do something wonderful, I suggest they buy it and return it to its former glory. And if my Euro Millions numbers ever come up, I'll do it myself. So Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
My matter of interest this week is an article that appeared in the Times last week by Patrick Maguire, who's just written a book with Gabriel Pogrund called Get In about Keir Starmer, which I'm very much looking forward to reading when it comes out next week. But this article was called To Take on the Right, Will Labour Go Blue? And in this article, Patrick Maguire writes that Blue Labour is back. Now, some of our listeners may be familiar with what Blue Labour is, but perhaps not all of our listeners. Blue Labour is a sort of a faction or an entity within the Labour Party that was set up about 15 years ago by the now Labour peer Maurice Glassman to push back against the idea that Labour was a progressive party. For Blue Labour, Labour is a socialist party, but it is not a progressive party. And I think this might sound a little odd to some listeners because the idea of being progressive and left-wing are often tied up together. But from Blue Labour perspective, progressivism is best perhaps summed up in that New Labour anthem, which also happened to be our first dance at our wedding, things can only get better. But from the perspective of Blue Labour, the story of socialism in Britain is a much more melancholy one, and that's where the blue comes from. It doesn't actually come from any reference to the blue of the Conservative Party. The idea is that things have gotten worse and worse over time, and the rot really set in about 1066 with the Norman Conquest. And if you go back, this may sound a very strange kind of recounting, but actually this was a very common view among British socialism and the working class in the late 19th and early 20th century, which was the idea, people like Keir Hardie propounded this as well, it's the idea that before the Norman Conquest, Britain was an equal and free society. And then the Normans came in as a conquering force. They took away the common land. They took away the wealth of the working class, and they imposed a class system. And that the history of Britain has been about the ruling class constantly extracting the wealth from the working class, whether that's the Industrial Revolution, which again might be seen as a form of technological progress, but from the perspective of Blue Labour, it was a tragedy. Those mills were truly dark and satanic. And capitalism in the 20th and 21st century and globalization that has accompanied it is again another tragedy for the British working class. And I'm very attracted to this particular line of thinking. But I suppose one of the issues that Blue Labour sometimes had is translating this really elegant, romantic, historical, philosophical take on socialism in Britain into ideas that would capture present-day Labour policy making. And Patrick Maguire argues that this is now the task that some people in the Blue Labour movement are undertaking, that there's a small group of Labour MPs who have formed a Blue Labour group. And I think really perhaps the Blue and Blue Labour today maybe would be better thought of as sort of blue-collar Labour, a try to return Labour to a sense of its working class traditions and roots, but also a sense of the value of things like building things, manufacturing things, the value of having anchor institutions in communities. And this could all potentially be rolled up into some kind of vision of Britain after leaving the EU, which is much more focused on its kind of own internal economic planning and industrial strategy. These are very early days for the Blue Labour movement's influence with the new Labour government. This is the first time there's been a Labour government since Blue Labour properly came into effect. And we shall see if Keir Starmer and those around him, like Morgan McSweeney, are receptive to this line of thinking. I personally think that if they want to do what a Labour Party is set up to do and to win elections, this is a good way of doing it. But there will be a lot of internal forces from the more progressive wing of the party that will be pushing back against it. So watch this space.
So this week we're looking at Labour Zionism, or Labour's views on the state of Israel. And I'll mostly be asking the questions as this is something that Richard has researched and written about extensively. So, Richard, let's begin by going back to the beginning of the 20th century. There were obviously debates going on in the United Kingdom and around the world at the time about the question of a Jewish state, leading most famously to the Balfour Declaration in this country. Declaration, on the face of it, seems a slightly odd term for it, as it's a letter, really, but it contains a declaration. And the letter is from A.J. Balfour, the former Prime Minister and then Foreign Secretary, to Lord Rothschild, a very prominent British Jewish person. But what it does do is it commits the United Kingdom to supporting a, quote, national home for Jewish people in Palestine. But of course, this is in 1917, so it was years before Labour would come close to being involved in or forming a government. So what debates were going on in the young infant Labour Party at the time about a national home for Jewish people?
Well, actually, Labour's support for a Jewish state in Palestine predates the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was sent, as you said, as a letter sent in November of 1917. But the Labour Party's War Aims Memorandum called for, quote, a free state under international guarantee, to which such of the Jewish people as desired to do so may return. And that statement was published 3 months earlier in August 1917 and endorsed by the Labour Party conference that year, by a vote of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and by Labour's ruling National Executive Committee. And this is not really at all surprising, because Labour had already, at this point in 1917, established itself as the party of Jewish voters in Britain. Back in 1905, the Conservative government had tried to restrict Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe with the Aliens Act, at the time when many Jews were fleeing the Russian Empire's pogroms. The Prime Minister at the time, who was actually trying to stop Jews from entering Britain, was ironically Arthur Balfour, who then wrote the Balfour Declaration. But after the 1917 War Aims Declaration, over the next 3 decades, the Labour Party was consistent in its support for the formation of a Jewish state. 11 Labour Party conferences in those interwar years voted to affirm that support. And one of the great debates in the interwar years in Britain was about the question of Jewish migration to Palestine. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, the League of Nations gave or tasked Britain with the mandate for Palestine. And so it was the British government that had to manage that part of the world. And the conservative governments of that era became increasingly antipathetic to the movement of Jews, particularly at that point from Europe to Palestine, because this was upsetting a lot of the Arab states and populations in the region. And so in 1939, the Conservative Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald announced that the British government would cap the number of Jews entering Palestine to 1,500 per month, and that Jewish rights to land ownership in the Palestine Mandate would be severely restricted. And this is a moment where the Labour Party really reacts in great righteous anger at this government policy. The left-wingers Michael Foot and Dick Crossman characterized, quote, to limit Jewish immigration just at the moment when Palestine was the sole available refuge from Hitler would be a crime against humanity. And Herbert Morrison, who would serve as deputy leader of the Labour Party for many years, pleaded with MPs in a debate in the House of Commons about this to, quote, remember the sufferings of these Jewish people all over the world. I ask them to remember that Palestine, of all the places in the world, was certainly the place where they had some right to expect not to suffer, to have restrictions imposed on them. And another prominent MP, whose now name is forgotten, but was actually a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, Philip Noel Baker, denounced this immigration cap as unworkable and immoral. He said, quote, illegal immigration of these tortured people from Germany and from elsewhere would happen anyway, and the Jews of Palestine will go by the tens of thousands down to the beach to welcome and to cover and protect their landing. Conservative opposition to a Jewish state, quote, will fail because in the most tragic hour of Jewish history, the British people will not deny them their promised land. So there's a consistent theme from Labour MPs in the interwar years. Of course, the horrors of the Holocaust were not yet known, but the Nuremberg laws were in effect. The discrimination and prejudice that was being shown against Jews in Germany and elsewhere was already known. Of course, we had the Kindertransport. Here, we now know that Clement Attlee secretly took a Jewish boy into his home when he was leader of the opposition. Or actually, I think this was when he was deputy prime minister during the war itself, as part of that Kindertransport. So this was something that many, many Labour MPs felt was a moral imperative and was really part of Labour's kind of socialist foreign policy vision.
mean, that's a remarkable history there, certainly before the Second World War. The moment when the case for Israel peaks, and for many people the moral case certainly crystallizes, is in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, particularly when the horrors that have taken place in the Holocaust are fully exposed. And this is also, of course, the point at which we're about to have the first majority Labour government in this country's history. So thinking about that time as we approach 1945, Labour's on the brink of government and then enters government with this landslide win. What is Labour thinking about Israel and the Zionist question at the time?
Well, I suppose there's that old cliche that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And so once Labour comes into government in 1945, some of the uh, complexities of this issue are now confronting the Labour Party in a way that wasn't the case when Labour was in opposition in the 1930s. And namely, Clement Attlee, the new Labour Prime Minister, had to contend with the opposition by Muslims around the world to the creation of Israel. And this was a particularly sensitive matter for Attlee because Attlee believed very passionately in independence for India, and he wanted that to be one of the great accomplishments of his government. In fact, later in life, Attlee, when asked what he considered to be the most important achievement or greatest achievement of that post-war Labour government, he doesn't say the NHS or the creation of the welfare state, he says independence for India. And of course, at that time, India, which included present-day Pakistan and Bangladesh, had a very, very substantial Muslim population. And so Attlee was concerned about backlash there. So initially, Attlee did not remove the immigration controls that the Conservatives had set into place, and instead turned to, as I suppose is quite common in politics, turned to creating some commission to study the matter and to make recommendations. And he did this jointly with the new American president, Harry Truman, called the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. Now, that committee reported the following year in May 1946. And Attlee had appointed onto that committee people who were quite pro-Zionist, including the aforementioned left-wing, now Labour MP, Richard Crossman. That committee recommended ending restrictions on Jewish migration and proposed that Palestine be opened up immediately for 100,000 refugee Jewish people fleeing Europe at the end of the Second World War.
Okay, and then we get to the big event, the formal foundation of the State of Israel. But one of the most important figures in the post-war Labour government, and certainly one of its most important figures in foreign policy, Ernest Bevin, is very sceptical about Israel at the time. Certainly that's how he's remembered. Why did his view come to diverge so sharply from what had been the Labour tradition? And what impact would that have within the Labour government and its approach?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Ernest Bevin, Lee, because Bevin is remembered by many as one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest Labour foreign secretaries. I understand that John Bew this week is going to give a public lecture at Policy Exchange, arguing that Labour should look to Ernest Bevin in reshaping its foreign policy and to move away from some of this progressive realism, as David Lammy, the current Foreign Secretary, calls it. But I do think for many people who know a bit more about Bevin, the question of Israel is a bit of a blot on his reputation. I mean, Bevin did not like the recommendations of the Committee of Inquiry. He said that the Americans were driving this push to allow Jewish refugees to go to Palestine because they didn't want too many Jews in New York. That's what he said. And this comment was seized upon by the media in America. And when Bevin went to the United States, he took the Queen Mary from Southampton to New York. And when he got off the vessel, there was a group of Jewish protesters who threw eggs at him. Bevin also has a reputation for anti-Semitism. And I think certainly a legitimate case could be made on that, and I wouldn't want to totally dismiss that. But I would say that many of Bevan's biographers are insistent that Bevan's antipathy or skepticism to the creation of a Jewish state of Israel was more due to what actually Tony Benn would later call, quote, the traditional anti-Israel bias in the Foreign Office, rather than a particular hatred of Jews. There is certainly evidence both ways on that. Bevan made comments about Jews which could be seen as anti-Semitic. But also Bevan championed Jewish trade unionists when he was the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, and including Jewish trade unionists in Palestine and what would become Israel. In 1936, Bevan told the Trade Union Congress, "It seems to me that the new star of Bethlehem, now shining over Jerusalem, is the star of socialism. We must give these people, the Jews, the opportunity of developing socialism, extending to them our blessing and helping them to build a new Jerusalem in Palestine." So I think I would side with the perspective, generally speaking, that Bevan's distaste for the creation of Israel came from an opinion of the British Foreign Office, which was more widely shared among the British elite. Of course, Bevan himself was someone from the working class, but many of the British elite, particularly kind of the technocratic civil service elite at that time, were quite strongly pro-Arab. And from the perspective of realpolitik, support for the Arabs made a lot more sense than support for the Jews. Britain's main interests in the Middle East were tied to oil, and trade routes were at that time controlled by Arab nations. And it was thought that there was little to be gained by offending the Arabs and pushing them closer to the circle of influence of the Soviet Union. And I actually think the differences between Michael Foot, who would become Labour leader, and his brother Hugh Foot are quite instructive in this regard. So Michael, of course, became a Labour MP and eventually Labour leader, whereas his brother Hugh was a civil servant, worked in the British colonial service. And like much of the British colonial service, he was a sympathizer with the Palestinian cause, so much so that the Palestinian flag was draped over his coffin at his funeral in 1990. Whereas Michael, on the other hand, really took the side of the Jews in this dispute. And as editor of Tribune, he employed many important Zionists. And at this time, in the post-war period, he writes with Richard Crossman a pamphlet called A Palestine Munich. This is 1946. Crossman and Foot believed that the Arab hostility to a Jewish state had been inflamed not just from anti-Semitism, but also by propaganda that had come out during the war against Jews from the Nazis and from fascists. And they argued in this pamphlet that the Labour Party was at risk of adopting a policy of appeasement. And of course, this accusation was a very, very emotive accusation to be made in Britain in 1946, and particularly to be made within the Labour Party in 1946. And they were concerned in this piece that the Labour government would consider throwing the Jews under the bus for the sake of geopolitics. They wrote in the piece, "Survivors of Hitler's gas chambers, now herded into the displaced person centers, should be permitted to join their friends and relatives in the national home." And this refugee crisis and the moral case for Israel only grew in the immediate years to follow, as so many of the majority Muslim states in North Africa and the Middle East began to expel their Jewish populations, many that had been there for centuries, even millennia. Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Morocco, Tunisia, told all of their Jews to leave. And so the Jewish homeland in Palestine became an even more obvious place, I think, for the creation of the State of Israel.
From the perspective of 2025, and with the past decade or so in mind in particular, the question of Israel, both the actions of its government but also its very existence, has of course been a hot button issue for the Labour Party still. And it strikes me that in recent years we often think of the Israel question in Labour as being a highly factional one. People on the left, especially some of Jeremy Corbyn's biggest fans, have often been vociferous in their opposition and criticism of Israel, whereas people on the Labour right have tended to be more enthusiastic and supportive. I'm thinking about those early decades after the end of the Second World War. Do you get any sense in those years of factionalism within Labour about the Israel question?
Well, not only was the Labour Party seen to be the much more pro-Zionist party, but it was actually the left of the Labour Party that was most closely associated with the Zionist cause. Nye Bevan, perhaps the most celebrated figure of the Labour left in the 1940s and 1950s, was a very strong supporter of Israel. He visited Israel in 1954, and he wrote poetically, as he did on so many topics, about the case for a Jewish state. And I think it's just worth quoting Bevan's reflections. He said, "For the Jew, the immediacy of his remote past is an intimate reality. He is living among places whose names are enshrined in his racial literature. They make sweet music to his ears. They whisper in his blood and evoke memories of a time that was before he was compelled to seek shelter in reluctant lands. When therefore the Arab says the Jew should find a home anywhere except in Palestine, he asks something the Jew cannot concede without mutilating his racial personality beyond endurance. It is no answer to say that many centuries have passed into history since the Jew was at home in Palestine. If he had been permitted the security of a safe home elsewhere, that answer might do, but as we know, it was not so." Tony Benn, another great hero of the Labour left, expressed similar emotions at the time. He had actually been on a kibbutz near the Golan Heights on VE Day when he had been serving in the RAF in the Middle East during the Second World War. And he had very fond memories, of course, of that wonderful day. Ben returned to Israel in 1956, so just 2 years after Bevan made his visit. And Ben wrote in his diary about how amazed he was about the social and economic progress that Israel had seen in just over a decade since he was there at the end of the Second World War. And he said that this progress was even more amazing because, quote, "underneath it all was the tragedy of 6 million dead in the gas chambers and the miracle of a home for Jews after 1900 years of pogrom and ghetto." Ben was a great admirer of the Jewish socialist movement, and he reflects in his diary saying, "Perhaps the kibbutzim have the answer. Stay rooted to the soil and pass it on more richly fertile than before to your sons and grandsons." So Israel, in the first few decades of its existence, was seen as a great socialist experiment. One Labour MP described Israel as undoubtedly the most effective social democracy in the world. And many Labour MPs saw Israel as a place to not only to admire, but to study and to understand how socialist governments could work and develop a country. And many Labour MPs in the decades after the Second World War and the creation of the State of Israel went over to Israel, went on tours of Israel, and went to study Israel, and particularly Labour MPs coming from the left. I mean, we have to remember that for the first 30 years of Israel's existence, all of its governments were left-wing socialist governments, and had very good relations with Labour leaders and Labour prime ministers at that time.
Okay, so you've spoken about Bevan and also Ben, two of the great figures of the post-war Labour left. So I want to move us on to talking about another one, Harold Wilson. He was, of course, one of the most prominent Labour figures from the 1950s right through to the 1970s. and led the party from 1963 to 76. One of the advantages of sharing a bookcase, as we do, is that I know that he wrote a book called The Chariot of Israel, Britain, America, and the State of Israel. So what did Israel mean to Wilson?
Well, as you say, Wilson also came out of the left of the Labour Party. He was one of the Bevanites, one of the keep left groups. He, of course, famously resigned from the Attlee government alongside Nye Bevan and a now forgotten figure, John Freeman, over the introduction of fees into certain elements of the NHS. Wilson, as time went on, had to moderate his political stances to hold together the Labour Party in large part. And some on the left felt that, perhaps Wilson had never been genuine about his left-wing beliefs, but I don't think that's fair. I think Wilson was always someone who was emotionally a figure of the left, but understood the exigencies of holding together this broad church Labour coalition. So he did some things that pleased the left, he did some things that pleased the right of the party, and sometimes he did things that pleased both, and sometimes things that pleased neither. It's interesting, though, on Israel, this is an issue where Wilson remained really quite consistent throughout his entire time in politics. We see little evidence of Wilson wishing or in any way, in actuality, moderating his very strong affinity to Israel. I think that affinity can be explained for much the same reasons that I've already gone through, about the belief that there was a vital moral reason for the creation of the State of Israel. Israel was a country that had a socialist ethos in it, that the governments of Israel were governments that were implementing policies that were instructive to the Labour Party, that the trade union movement in Israel was very strong. Wilson also had many Jewish friends. The Jewish electorate was a very pro-Labour electorate. And so throughout his time as leader and as prime minister, Wilson always argued for a strongly pro-Israel position. And this was recognized at the end of his leadership when he finally stood down as Labour leader in 1976, having first become leader in 1963, when the Zionist Federation named a forest in Israel after him as a recognition of his staunch support for Israel as Labour leader and prime minister.
It's highly consequential in that case that although Wilson would dominate British politics for much of this time, certainly from the 1964 general election to the point at which he finally retires in 1976, he isn't in office at the time of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. This brief conflict started on the 6th of October with a surprise attack on Israel and carried on till later on that month, with Israel on one side and a coalition of Arab states on the other. And if you'll indulge me to take a tangent into conservative politics, the Yom Kippur War really represents the nadir of relations between Israel and Edward Heath as conservative leader. Heath refused to even allow American planes to refuel at British bases when they were on their way to support Israel. And this became highly controversial both in the international sphere, but also within Heath's own party. It wasn't the first time, of course, that Heath's views on international relations would cause a bit of a backlash within his own party. One MP accused him of giving in to, quote, oily blackmail from the oil-rich Arab states. And Israel-supporting conservatives rallied together in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War to found the Conservative Friends of Israel group, a group which has since won many Tories to its cause and remains a very vocal supporter of Israel within the party today, and is a very common sight at Conservative Party conferences over recent years. So briefly put, that's the Tory picture at the time of the Yom Kippur War, that Edward Heath is not especially sympathetic and certainly not very supportive towards Israel. So what's going on in the Wilson-led Labour opposition at the time?
Well, there is a dispute within the Labour front bench at how supportive or oppositional the party should be towards the policies of Edward Heath. Now, Wilson believed that Heath was not at all sufficiently supportive of Israel. And he wanted to put down a motion demanding that the Conservative government send arms to support Israel during the Yom Kippur War. And Wilson wanted to make this a 3-line whip. And Roy Jenkins, who until a few months earlier had been Harold Wilson's deputy, but had to resign when he broke another 3-line whip to vote with Heath to bring Britain into the European Economic Community, said this was a bad idea. And Wilson is said to have erupted in the face of Roy Jenkins's intransigence. And he's alleged to have said, "Look, Roy, I've accommodated your fucking conscience for years. Now you're going to have to take account of mine." Wilson told Jenkins that he cared just as strongly about Israel as Roy Jenkins cared about Europe.
It's really staggering to hear that, and just remarkable how forgotten that part of Wilson's politics is. Over the decades, opinion about Israel within the Labour Party would become a much more divisive question. We see hints of it, I guess, there. When do you think there really began to be a hostility within the Labour Party towards Israel?
I think that the fissures really first started to open up after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza. And it's at this time that you see what we might call the new left take a view that revised the history of the creation of Israel, which depicted the Jews in Palestine not as both a historic population plus refugees, but just purely as a group of conquerors. But actually, even in 1967, it's really quite remarkable that mainstream opinion in the Labour Party and the Parliamentary Labour Party is still really very much on the Israeli side. After the Six-Day War, the Labour cabinet minister now, Richard Crossman, says to the cabinet, quote, that it's intolerable to order the Israelis back to their frontiers. The one thing one could safely say was that the 1967 frontiers of Israel were impossible peace frontiers. And when peace was made, there would certainly have to be a new frontier land in Samaria, on the Golan Heights, and possibly the Gaza Strip. So in a sense, Crossman is open to the idea that the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or the Golan Heights become integrated into a larger state of Israel, which is something that, of course, today you wouldn't hear pro-Israel Labour politicians articulate, but that was not seen as a particularly shocking view to make. In fact, the Foreign Secretary at that time, Michael Stewart, was sympathetic to this view, and he said to a Labour colleague, quote, "You must appreciate why I feel so strongly. I detest the situation where the poor Israelis are sitting there encircled by Arabs who refuse to recognize them." And in the 1960s, 1970s, the PLP was still very strongly Zionist. About 10% of Labour MPs at this time were Jewish. It's really quite remarkable to think. In 1966, 38 Jews were elected as Labour MPs, whereas in 2019, just 5 were. But you could see that sort of the grassroots left was starting to form a different opinion. One Labour MP commented on this at the time. His name was Raymond Fletcher. He denounced, quote, "the ignorant demagogues of the new left who echo the hate-charged slogans and contribute nothing to socialism except loud, hysterical noises on this issue." But from sort of, I'd say, the 1980s onwards, what had once been the kind of the more far-left elements view of Israel as a conquering, oppressive state starts to gain more purchase within the broader membership of the Labour Party, you start to see more Labour MPs who are more hostile to Israel. And I would explain this in three ways. First is that the continued occupations evoked antipathy towards Israel among the left. And really, I suppose as time went on, Israel did seem to be an occupying force in Palestine. Second, I think that the Palestinian cause, particularly through international groups that have supported them, has been very, very effective at pushing the pro-Palestinian position on the left. Since its founding in 2004, the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, I think, has been extremely effective at presenting that message in a way that is easily received by people on the left of politics. And then thirdly, of course, the politics of Israel itself, the domestic politics of Israel, has changed really, really dramatically. Israel's once dominant socialist movement has become moribund. And actually, I'll just add another point, one which I think we've seen has become more relevant in the results of the last general election, which is that the relative importance of Muslim versus Jewish voters within the Labour Party electoral coalition has shifted in profound ways since the 20th century, when the Jewish electorate was both strongly pro-Labour and also its relative size to the Muslim population was more even than it is today.
If we think about recent years, I think it's fair to say that Keir Starmer has clearly struggled with the Israel question. To begin with, when he was ambitious to be leader, he was pretty quiet about the distasteful, often anti-Semitic way in which some in Labour spoke about Israel. I've no doubt he would deny that, but I think he was. And he stayed in Corbyn's shadow cabinet throughout all of the furore about anti-Semitism. Then as leader, Starmer clearly sees tackling anti-Semitism as a moral imperative, I'm sure, within Labour, but also as something that comes with it political advantages, specifically distancing him from Jeremy Corbyn and Corbyn's legacy. This obviously peaks when Corbyn has the whip taken away from him. But that isn't necessarily the end of the controversy, with Starmer often seeming to walk an uncertain path on Israel and what the rights or the responsibilities of the Israeli government are, particularly after October the 7th, with certainly some Labour MPs adopting wildly different views about the question of Israel's response. All of which is to ask, where do you think Starmer and Labour are today on Israel? And who in today's Labour Party is flying the flag for this Labour Zionist tradition?
Well, of course, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, Lee, the politics of Israel within the Labour Party have sort of flipped internally. So the left of the Labour Party now is seen as much more hostile to Israel, and the right of the Labour Party is seen as much more strongly pro-Israel. And the Starmer project has been mostly championed by MPs on the right of the party. So we might expect Starmer to be more pro-Israel than, say, Jeremy Corbyn was. But there is an electoral challenge for the Labour Party, whatever side of the party you sit on, which is that Jewish voters are a very, very small part of the Labour coalition. And so this is just talking in pure electoral terms, putting aside the moral arguments of this issue. Just 0.5% of the British public is Jewish, and only about a fifth of them vote Labour. And that's been true for quite some time. Since the 1980s, Jews have been majority Conservative voting after being an overwhelmingly pro-Labour electorate for much of the 20th century. In 2019, just 20% of Jews voted Labour, but that's very similar under both Starmer and Corbyn to what it was under Gordon Brown. 21% of Jews voted Labour in 2010. And under Ed Miliband, of course, who himself was Jewish, only 22% of Jews voted Labour in 2010. In contrast, the Muslim electorate is much larger. There are about 14 times as many Muslims in Britain as there are Jews. And the Muslim electorate has historically and has, for the most part, with an important caveat or two, been a strongly pro-Labour electorate. In 2019, 80% of Muslims voted Labour. Now, there have been periods of time when the Muslim vote has walked away from the Labour Party, notably in the New Labour period in the aftermath of the Iraq War and anger about Iraq. Only a third of Muslims voted Labour in the 2010 general election. A majority actually voted Lib Dem. And this cost Labour a couple of seats. Labour lost Bradford East, the Liberal Democrats, for example, on this issue. But really, this way in which the Muslim electorate can show its electoral weight was shown most dramatically in last year's general election. There's been some interesting research that's come out from Aston University by Dr. Parveen Akhtar on this. In the last general election, constituencies with the highest number of voters identifying as Muslim were the constituencies where Labour had the sharpest fall in its vote. There are 21 constituencies that are a third Muslim or more. And on average, in those constituencies, Labour's vote share dropped from 65% to 36%. That's a 29-point drop for a party that was increasing its vote share nationally, not that dramatically, it has to be said, but it was. And of course, winning a landslide majority. And Labour lost 5 seats, previously safe seats, to independent candidates in strongly Muslim constituencies across the country. And other prominent Labour MPs like Wes Streeting, Shabana Mahmood, Jess Phillips also came very close to losing their seats to independent challengers who were angry that Labour was, in their view, too pro-Israel and not sympathetic enough on the Gaza question. So the electoral incentives now place a certain degree of pressure on Labour. Now, there are campaigning organizations that argue for a secure state of Israel and also an independent, viable, secure state of Palestine under the right conditions. And that's the group, the Labour Friends of Israel. That was actually set up long before the Conservative Friends of Israel. It was set up, I believe, in about 1957. And that organization does campaign to support the cause of Israel within the Labour Party and the cause of a two-state solution. I think it's one of its limitations, or one of the difficulties that Labour Friends of Israel has, is it is seen as quite a factional organization, rightly or wrongly, and it is seen as aligned to the right of the party. And I think for those who view themselves as more on the left of centre of the party, as I in fact do, even if some people don't think I do, I do, is that this longer standing tradition of left Zionism in the Labour Party needs to be better understood, and I think has to have better proponents than it has had in recent years. And I do hope that there are Labour MPs who are not factually on the right, or perhaps not factually affiliated to any particular group, who look seriously at Labour's history on this issue and make a case for why it's important to support a secure Jewish state in Israel now and into the future.
It's a remarkable history that you've set out there, particularly about the Labour left, transitioning from that very pro-Zionist tradition to now being really the most sceptical part of the Labour Party, the most critical and sometimes the most violently critical part of the Labour Party about Israel. It's a question that's clearly not going to go away in the years to come. One of the things that's interested me has been this the so-called Gaza independence in the House of Commons. Those MPs who managed to displace Labour MPs and some traditionally really quite safe Labour constituencies, who now have formed a sort of alliance alongside Jeremy Corbyn. So far, they seem to have been the dog that hasn't barked almost in Parliament. You don't really hear much about them. I know there's only 5 or so of them, but you don't really hear much about them. They're not really putting pressure on the Labour front bench, even though they now have somebody who was at one time almost a messiah figure for a lot of people within the Labour Party among them. So what they choose to do, both in terms of holding their own constituencies, in terms of trying to reach out into other parliamentary constituencies where they think the message that got them elected is viable and credible, and whether or not they try and launch a broader challenge to Labour is going to be a really interesting thing to see play out. We've not seen signs of it yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we heard much more from that small grouping of opposition MPs in the future. We finished with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. So, Richard, why don't you go first?
Well, I've started reading The Betrayal of Anne Frank, a Cold Case Investigation by Rosemary Sullivan. Now, many of us will have read the diary of Anne Frank when we were younger. I certainly had to read it when I was at school. And of course, it's really one of the great extraordinary documents of world literature. A child writing for 2 years in confinement with 7 other de facto prisoners, deprived of schooling, social interaction with other children, the ability to run around and play, even fresh air. They weren't even allowed, or, these are the rules they set up on themselves. They weren't even able to open the windows of the annex in case that alerted attention to them in hiding. And yet, in spite of this, Anne remains so hopeful in her diaries about the human condition and about her future. And it's such a tragic document because, of course, we know how it all ends when she doesn't. Her last entry is in August of 1944, just before her family and their close friends, who are all in hiding for those 2 years, are rounded up and sent to their deaths. And of the 8 hiding in that secret annex, 7 are killed. Only Otto Frank, their father, survives. Now, a few years ago, a team of cold case investigators set out to try and find who betrayed the Franks in the annex. We've never known. We know the police officer who went to the annex and ordered them out, and which led to them being put on the trains to the concentration camps. He was discovered in the 1960s. It turned out that he was a police officer in the Vienna police after the war. He was quite unapologetic about what he did and actually quite unsympathetic. And the interview with him is very disturbing. He makes himself out to be really the victim in this, rather than the people he sent to their deaths. But we don't actually know who tipped off the police. And so this book reads a bit like a murder mystery, of course, with a much weightier topic, but it has a sort of fast pace. The chapters are very, very short. Sets out to try and find who did it, who betrayed the Franks. Now, the book, I haven't finished the book, but I understand the book does point its finger at a particular individual. And this has proven very controversial, I understand, and actually some booksellers eventually stopped selling the book because historians argued that this team had spoken with too great a certainty about this person for whom there was only circumstantial evidence as to whether or not they reported the Franks. So I think that element of it has to be taken with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, I think the book is very good at conveying the sense of claustrophobia of a place under military occupation where everyone is living in fear and constant suspicion, with the threat of death lurking for even the smallest infraction, and how that takes away all sense of control that one has over one's life. And I've always felt very touched by the story of Anne Frank. It's remarkable how the story of one individual can personalize a tragedy that affected, in this case, 6 million, and even more, because that 6 million died, but millions others who survived but lived with the scars of the Holocaust. Anne Frank was 8 years younger than my own grandmother, who I knew growing up, who I loved, who lived until I was in my 20s. And so, although we talk about this as a matter of history, it's not actually that distant history. And in another sense, it's still very close to us. There are still survivors of those camps today. And the world that's described in this book of Amsterdam in the 1940s is both at one point, in one sense, unimaginable, but in another way, looks very modern, familiar, and recognizable. So, Lee, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, on the point of the book you were just discussing then, I did want to note just an observation from my side is I do feel as if our generation, we're in our early to mid 30s, has been incredibly fortunate to have had a reasonable period of crossover with that generation who were around at the time of the Second World War. You clearly feel that with the people who fought in the Second World War, in a declining number, of course, who were there for the D-Day landings, etc., the diminishing turnout brought on by mortality at the commemoration events. But you also feel, I think, particularly strongly with the declining number of people who survived having suffered in the Holocaust and who were around to tell their story in person in a way that our lives crossed over with. But the next generation of young people won't necessarily have had the chance to hear from firsthand. So there's a huge amount that goes on, including stuff that the King has been very supportive of, to try and make sure those stories aren't lost, because it's such horrendous, brutal history that can almost feel alien and detached from us if you aren't actually forced to confront the reality of what happened. And I think that's a hugely important thing to be able to do. Also on a gloomy topic, I'm currently reading Failed State by Sam Friedman. It's a book which came out late last year and I think did very well, in fact. And it basically explores one of the central questions of our age, which is why the British state seems to be unable to deliver basic services well. I'm in the fairly early stages of the book, so perhaps I'll reflect at the moment on just something good and something I'm a bit critical of so far. There's a chapter in it called Contract Killings, and it's about the way that public services in sectors where there's no private sector competitive market have been put up to tender with disastrous consequences. I think it's an incredibly compelling and really quite frustrating chapter. Friedman argues, and I think rightly, that there are examples of sectors with existing competitive markets where the risk can be passed on to companies and where failure isn't disastrous, and that they are suitable for contracting out services. An example of that might be cleaning in a public sector building, for example. But then there are areas where there is no existing market, for example, parole and rehabilitation services, and where the government can't pass on the risk because it remains ultimately responsible, and where the cost of failure are enormous. Care homes for children with very high needs would be another example of that. And in these cases, the state has sometimes outsourced key services, lost its own capacity, and come to depend on non-specialist companies who become expert at bidding for contracts but not at delivering them. It can end up costing much, much more than it should, and it can leave some of the most vulnerable people in society being let down. That is a chapter which I think everybody who's involved in delivering public services in Britain should read. Something I'm a bit more skeptical of about the book then. So Friedman makes a lot of the arguments we're quite used to hearing about how centralized the state is in our country. And he talks of devolution as not quite a panacea, but as a required feature of a better functioning British state with better public services. I have a couple of issues with this. One is that devolution to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland is very extensive. And in those places, public services are often worse than in England. The Welsh NHS and the Scottish Education Service are much criticised examples, but they're examples of where Westminster has devolved power and the services that people receive are failing. That's worth exploring and explaining, in my view, certainly if we're to jump feet first into more devolution. But Friedman doesn't really touch on those topics and basically says this is a book overwhelmingly about England. He does then mention the mayors where there has been devolution within England, but doesn't, for my liking anyway, really engage in whether they've been successful or not. But many UK mayors have now been around for quite a long time and with really significant powers. Sadiq Khan has powers over policing in London. Andy Burnham in Manchester has extensive responsibility for healthcare. Ben Houchin in Teesside bought an airport. These are really quite significant powers that have been devolved to mayors. And I think the arguments about devolution, and if those arguments are to stand up, really ought to be more closely appraised and scrutinised before we necessarily rush into further devolution and expect it to change things in terms of how public services work. It's a book I'm enjoying. I think it is well written. It's very often compelling. And it's part of a really important debate that we need to have as a country about how the state can and should deliver better services. And that debate is only going to become more important if economic growth remains sluggish or our demographics make us a population that demands more of the state whilst contributing less to it.
Well, it sounds to me like this book is somewhat reflective of this, to my mind, very frustrating dogmatism for devolution among actually the British elite, not actually from British voters. There is this perception from British politicians and policymakers you see in the think tank world and academia and across the political parties, which is devolution must always be good. I mean, I can remember about a year ago, Wes Streeting made some kind of comment where he said the purpose of the Labour Party is to win power to give it away. And I thought, well, surely it matters to whom you give it away. And if you give it away to actors who are actually working against your policy objectives, then is that really what you want to be doing? I mean, if you give away control over, I don't know, let's say health policy, and then, as is often the case, the opposite party is elected at the lower level of government. It's a very common phenomenon across the world that the governing party's party loses local elections. Well, what if you had a reform mayor who said, we're going to start charging people to see their GPs, or we're going to start fully privatizing certain NHS services? And since you've devolved health policy to this, whatever it is, regional authority, well, what are you going to do about it? You've given that power away. We see this all the time in federal systems. I think of a really, in my view, a very tragic example a couple of years ago when during COVID, Joe Biden got congressional funding to provide meals to go to poor children who were normally recipients of free school meals but weren't going to school because of the pandemic, to get those meals sent out to the children across the country. And about a dozen Republican governors just refused to take the money and implement the program. And under the federal system of the American Constitution, it is within their right to refuse to do that. I mean, I can't really see why that is sensible public policy, particularly from people who would see themselves on the left, but I think even more generally. But that's my little bee in my bonnet over devolution.
You're undoubtedly right. Parts of the left that are very enthusiastic about devolution. It's mostly the case because so far they've devolved power to jurisdictions that are quite likely to vote for left-wing parties, even if they become in opposition to the Westminster government. Because in Wales, it's always been led by Labour since devolution. Scotland, it's been some Labour-led coalition or the SNP, who often pitch themselves as a left-wing party. And even in the cities, they've either often been Labour or where they've had Conservative mayors in quite a lot of these cities, say Boris Johnson or Andy Street. They've been the sort of Conservatives that people on the left can live with. It would be a really interesting dynamic to say, like, have really profound evolution in East Anglia or Lincolnshire, where reform could be competitive in years to come, and whether or not the left would tolerate them having the same sort of devolved discretion over policy as they do in some cities and other parts of the United Kingdom now.
Mayor Richard Tice of Lincolnshire, who says that council housing is only available to people born in the United Kingdom. I mean, if you are truly devolving serious powers, then you could have really undesirable consequences.
Definitely something we'll come back to, I think, devolution is something we're both pretty interested in. We'll have a link to the books that we've discussed in our show notes, but that's all from us for this week. We hope you've enjoyed this look into the history of Labour Zionism. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we'd be grateful if you could leave us a review on whichever podcast platform you use. And if you haven't enjoyed the podcast, well, forget I said anything. We'll be back next week with another dip into Britain's post-war political history. Do join us then.
Thanks very much.